Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another powerful and helpful episode here at Code Your English, the channel where we don't just learn English. We think in English, we feel in English, and today we're going to grow in English. If this is your first time joining us, welcome to the family. My name is Jason, and on this channel we believe that real fluency doesn't come from memorizing grammar rules in isolation. It comes from engaging with real ideas, powerful conversations, and the kind of vocabulary that you'll actually want to use in your own life. So make yourself comfortable, grab your coffee or your tea, and settle in, because today's episode is one that I believe almost every single one of you is going to feel personally connected to. Before we dive in, if you're new here, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because every single episode on Code Your English is designed to push your English from intermediate to advanced, from simply getting by to genuinely expressing yourself with nuance, depth, and confidence. And if you've been here before, welcome back, my friend. You already know what we do here. We take big, universal human topics, and we explore them slowly, richly, and thoughtfully, using language that will stretch your vocabulary and sharpen your listening comprehension at the same time. So, let's talk about today's topic. It's called Why Most Goals Fail, and honestly, I think this might be one of the most important episodes we've ever recorded, not just for your English, but for your life. The frustration of unfinished goals. Let's start with a question, and I want you to actually think about it, not just let it pass by. How many goals have you set in your life that you eventually abandoned? Not one, not two, probably dozens, maybe even more than you'd like to admit. Think about it for a second. The gym membership you signed up for in January, the language course you started with so much enthusiasm, the book you promised yourself you'd finish, the business idea you sketched out on a napkin at 2 in the morning, full of fire and ambition, only to let it quietly fade into the background of your daily routine a few weeks later. This is such a universal experience that it almost feels like a shared human condition. We set goals with genuine excitement. We genuinely believe, in that moment, that this time will be different. And yet, somehow, week after week, month after month, year after year, so many of those goals simply evaporate. They don't explode in some dramatic failure. They don't end with a clear, defining moment where we say, "I give up." Instead, they fade. They dissolve quietly into the background of busy schedules, distractions, and disappointment. And here's the thing I really want you to sit with today. The reason most goals fail is rarely, if ever, simple laziness. I know that's the explanation we often give ourselves. I'm just lazy. I don't have enough discipline. I'm not a disciplined person. But that explanation, while comforting in its simplicity, is almost always incomplete, and often it's simply wrong. The truth is far more layered, far more psychological, and honestly, far more interesting than laziness. There are deeper, hidden forces at play, forces related to identity, emotion, cognition, and the structures we build, or fail to build, around our daily lives. Think about the emotional cycle that so many of us experience when we pursue a goal. It usually begins with excitement, that initial burst of energy and hope when we first decide to change something. Then comes effort. We start doing the work, showing up, putting in the hours. After that, inevitably, comes struggle. The moment when things get harder than we expected, when motivation starts to waver, when the initial thrill fades into something more like obligation. And then, often without us even realizing it's happening, comes quitting. Not a dramatic, conscious decision, but a slow drift away from the goal. And finally, there's guilt. that uncomfortable, nagging feeling that lingers afterward, the quiet voice that says, "You should have kept going. What's wrong with you?" If you recognize this cycle, you are not alone, and more importantly, you are not broken. This cycle is so common precisely because it's rooted in things far deeper than willpower. So today, we're going to dismantle this cycle piece by piece. We're going to look at the motivation myth, the conflict between our goals and our identity, the hidden power of habits, our obsession with instant results, the emotional resistance that quietly sabotages us, the importance of systems over goals, the role of resilience, and finally, we'll end with a reflection on what real transformation actually requires. So buckle up, or as we might say in more advanced English, settle in for the ride, because this is going to be a deep one. The motivation myth. Why excitement never lasts. Let's talk about motivation, because I think this is one of the most misunderstood concepts in the entire conversation around personal growth. Most of us have been taught, whether explicitly or implicitly, that motivation is the fuel we need to achieve our goals. We wait for it. We chase it. We watch inspirational videos to get motivated. We tell ourselves that once we feel motivated enough, the hard work will somehow become easy. But here's the problem with that belief. Motivation is, by its very nature, an emotion. And like every other emotion, joy, sadness, anger, excitement, it is temporary. It rises and falls. It responds to external circumstances, to our mood, to how much sleep we got the night before, to whether something exciting just happened to us, or whether we're simply feeling a bit tired and uninspired. Relying on motivation to drive consistent, long-term action is a little like trying to build a house on a foundation that shifts every single day. Some days the foundation feels solid. Other days it crumbles beneath you entirely. This is precisely why motivation feels so powerful at the very beginning of any new goal. When we first decide to make a change, to start exercising, to learn a new skill, to pursue a new career path, we are flooded with a sense of possibility. Everything feels fresh and exciting. We can vividly imagine the future version of ourselves who has already succeeded. But emotions, by their very design, fluctuate. They are not meant to remain constant. And so, inevitably, the initial wave of enthusiasm begins to recede, often much sooner than we expect. What replaces motivation, then, for those who actually achieve long-term success? The answer is discipline, and more specifically, the ability to take consistent action even when the emotional excitement isn't there. This is the crucial distinction between motivation and discipline that I want you to internalize today. Motivation is what gets you started, but discipline, or, more accurately, consistency built on systems and identity, which we'll discuss shortly, is what keeps you going long after the initial excitement has disappeared. So here's a reflection question I want you to genuinely consider, not just pass over. Do you only take action when you feel like it? Do you only go to the gym on the days you feel energetic and inspired? Do you only practice English, dear listener, on the days when you feel particularly enthusiastic about learning? And if so, what happens on the days when that feeling simply doesn't show up? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Those feelings won't always show up. In fact, on most days, in the middle of any meaningful pursuit, they probably won't. The question, then, isn't how to manufacture endless motivation. The question is how to build a life, a structure, an identity that doesn't depend on it. Goals without identity. The inner conflict. Now we move into something a little deeper, a little more psychological, and honestly, This is where I think the real magic of understanding goal failure begins to emerge. Here's a principle that I want you to hold on to carefully. Behavior follows identity. Let that sink in for a moment. We don't simply act according to what we want. We act according to who we believe ourselves to be. This might sound abstract, so let's make it concrete. Imagine someone who desperately wants to become more organized, more disciplined, more productive. They set ambitious goals. They buy the planner, the productivity app, the color-coded calendar. And yet, deep down, in their private internal dialogue, they still think of themselves as someone who procrastinates, someone who's always a little chaotic, someone who just isn't that kind of person. Do you see the conflict here? There is a fundamental contradiction between the goal they're chasing externally and the identity they're holding internally. And in almost every case, identity wins. This is one of the most overlooked reasons that goals fail. We focus so intensely on the outcome, losing weight, starting a business, becoming fluent in English, saving money, that we completely neglect the underlying question of who we believe we are. And if our internal self-image contradicts the goal we're pursuing, we end up in a state of constant internal friction, a kind of psychological tug-of-war where one part of us is reaching forward while another part is quietly, perhaps even unconsciously, pulling us back. Lasting change, real and sustainable transformation, requires something deeper than simply setting a target. It requires an actual shift in self-image. Instead of saying, "I want to write a book," someone committed to identity-based change might begin to say, "I am a writer." Instead of saying, "I'm trying to learn English," they might begin to say, "I am someone who speaks English." This isn't just a clever trick of language. Though, of course, on a podcast about English learning, I have to point out how powerful this linguistic shift truly is. It's a fundamental reorientation of how we see ourselves, and from that reorientation, new behaviors begin to flow naturally, almost effortlessly, because they are now aligned with our internal narrative, rather than fighting against it. So I want you to ask yourself honestly, who do you believe you are? Not who you wish you were, not who you present yourself as on social media, but who you genuinely believe yourself to be in those quiet, private moments when no one else is watching. And then ask yourself the harder question. Does that identity support your goals, or does it quietly sabotage them? Because if there's a mismatch, no amount of willpower, no amount of motivation, no number of beautifully written goals in a journal will be enough to bridge that gap. The bridge has to be built from the inside, through a genuine shift in self-perception. The hidden power of habits and cognitive patterns. Let's move now to something equally fascinating: the role of habits and the largely unconscious patterns that quietly run our lives. Here's a truth that might be a little uncomfortable to accept. Much of our daily existence operates on autopilot. We like to think of ourselves as rational, intentional beings, carefully weighing decisions and consciously choosing our actions throughout the day. But the reality is that an enormous proportion of our behavior is automatic, driven by deeply ingrained habits and cognitive patterns that we rarely, if ever, examine. Think about your morning routine. The order in which you check your phone, make your coffee, get dressed, leave the house. Much of this happens with very little conscious thought. Your brain, in its efficiency, has automated these processes so that you don't need to expend mental energy reconsidering them every single day. And this is exactly the mechanism that determines, often invisibly, whether our goals succeed or fail. Daily habits, those small, seemingly insignificant repeated actions, quietly accumulate over time, and their cumulative effect is far more powerful than any single moment of intense motivation or effort. This is the essence of what psychologists and behavioral scientists often call habit loops, a cycle that begins with a cue, something that triggers the behavior, followed by a routine, the actual behavior itself, and finally a reward, the psychological payoff that reinforces the loop and makes it more likely to repeat. Once a habit loop is established, the behavior becomes largely automatic, requiring very little conscious willpower to maintain. This is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing when the habit loop supports a goal we care about. For instance, automatically reaching for your English podcast every morning during your commute, the way I genuinely hope you're doing right now. But it's a curse when the habit loop works against us. Automatically reaching for the phone to scroll mindlessly instead of opening that English textbook you promised yourself you'd study from. The concept of behavioral inertia is also worth dwelling on here. Inertia, as you may remember from physics, describes the tendency of an object to continue doing whatever it's already doing. Staying still if it's still, moving if it's moving, unless some force acts upon it. Human behavior operates in a remarkably similar way. We tend to continue our existing patterns simply because they are existing patterns, regardless of whether they actually serve our long-term goals. Breaking this inertia requires deliberate intervention, a new environment, a new trigger, a new structure, because simply wanting to change without altering the underlying pattern is rarely enough. So here's the reflection I want to leave you with in this section. How much of your daily behavior is genuinely intentional, consciously chosen in the moment, and how much of it is simply repetition, patterns you've fallen into so deeply that you no longer even notice you're following them? I'd encourage you, dear listener, to spend just one day this week paying close attention to your own automatic behaviors. You might be surprised by what you discover about the invisible architecture that's quietly shaping your life. Unrealistic expectations. The need for instant results. Now let's talk about something that I believe is uniquely amplified by the world we live in today. Our collective obsession with speed, with instant results, with the desire to see transformation happen almost immediately. We live in an era of same-day delivery, instant messaging, and content that's designed to be consumed in seconds rather than minutes. And this cultural conditioning has profoundly shaped our expectations around personal growth and goal achievement, often in deeply unhelpful ways. Social media, in particular, deserves special attention here, because it creates a deeply distorted picture of how transformation actually happens. We scroll through carefully curated highlight reels, the before and after photos, the success stories condensed into a 60-second video, the entrepreneur celebrating their 7-figure exit, and we unconsciously absorb the message that meaningful change happens quickly, dramatically, and visibly. What we don't see, of course, are the years of quiet, unglamorous effort that preceded that single triumphant moment. We don't see the thousands of hours of practice, the countless failed attempts, the long stretches of seemingly invisible progress that occurred long before any external result became apparent. This creates a profound mismatch between expectation and reality. People underestimate, often quite dramatically, how much time genuine transformation actually requires. They expect to see visible results within weeks, sometimes even days, and when those results don't materialize on schedule, they interpret this as evidence that the goal isn't working, that the method is flawed, that perhaps they simply aren't capable of achieving what they set out to do. But in reality, slow growth is not the same thing as absent growth. It simply feels invisible because the time scale of genuine change rarely aligns with our impatient, instant gratification-conditioned expectations. This brings us to a concept worth exploring carefully: delayed gratification. The capacity to forego an immediate, smaller reward in favor of a larger, more meaningful reward that will only materialize further down the line. This capacity, research consistently suggests, is one of the strongest predictors of long-term success across virtually every domain of life: finances, health, relationships, career, and yes, even language learning. Closely related is the idea of long-term thinking, the ability to evaluate decisions not based on how they feel in this immediate moment, but based on their cumulative effect over months, years, even decades. And this leads us naturally to the concept of compounding progress. The idea that small, consistent improvements, when sustained over a long enough period, eventually produce results that appear almost miraculous, even though each individual step along the way felt unremarkable, even insignificant. If you improve your English by just 1% every single day, the daily change is barely perceptible. But compounded over a year, that 1% daily improvement produces a transformation so significant that the person you were a year ago would barely recognize the person you've become. So, here's a question I want you to sit with honestly, perhaps the most important question in this entire episode. Are you quitting a goal because it genuinely isn't working? Or are you quitting simply because it isn't working fast enough to satisfy your impatience? These are two very different problems, and conflating them is one of the most common and most costly mistakes people make on the path toward any meaningful goal. Emotional resistance, the invisible enemy. Let's now turn to something that operates almost entirely beneath the surface of our conscious awareness, yet exerts an enormous influence over whether we follow through on our goals: emotional resistance. This is perhaps the most subtle and most misunderstood obstacle of everything we'll discuss today, because it rarely announces itself directly. It doesn't say, "I'm afraid." Instead, it disguises itself as something far more innocent-sounding: procrastination, distraction, sudden busyness, or a vague sense that now just isn't the right time. At the heart of emotional resistance, we typically find some combination of fear, self-doubt, and discomfort. And these emotions are far more sophisticated, far more cunning than we often give them credit for. Consider the fear of failure, the deep-seated worry that if we genuinely try and don't succeed, we'll be forced to confront some painful truth about our own limitations. This fear is so uncomfortable for many people that they unconsciously choose not to try fully, because not trying preserves a comforting illusion. I could have succeeded if I'd really tried. Partial effort, paradoxically, can feel safer than full effort, precisely because it protects us from ever discovering the answer to that frightening question. But here's something that often surprises people. There's also a fear of success, which sounds almost contradictory at first, but is remarkably common. Success often brings change: new responsibilities, increased visibility, higher expectations, shifts in relationships and identity. For some people, on a subconscious level, this kind of change feels threatening, even when it's the very thing they consciously claim to want. And then, underlying both of these fears, we find perhaps the most fundamental fear of all: the fear of change itself. Human beings are, by nature, creatures of comfort and predictability. Even when our current circumstances aren't particularly satisfying, there is a strange, perverse comfort in familiarity. Simply because it's known, because it's predictable, because it doesn't require us to step into the uncertain territory of becoming someone new. This is closely connected to the concept of limiting beliefs. Those deeply held, often unconscious convictions about ourselves and the world that quietly constrain what we believe is possible. Beliefs like, "I'm just not a disciplined person," or "people like me don't succeed at things like this," or "I've always been bad at sticking with goals." These beliefs feel like objective facts, but they are, in reality, simply stories we've told ourselves so many times that they've calcified into what feels like permanent truth. And as long as these limiting beliefs remain unexamined, they will continue to generate the very resistance that sabotages our efforts. So I want to leave you with two deeply honest reflection questions here. First, what emotions genuinely arise within you when you move toward your most important goals? Not the emotions you think you're supposed to feel, but the ones that actually surface. Perhaps excitement, but perhaps also anxiety, dread, or an unsettling sense of unfamiliarity. And second, and perhaps more importantly, what are you really avoiding when you procrastinate or quietly abandon a goal? Because in my experience, and in the experience of countless psychologists who've studied this phenomenon extensively, it's rarely the goal itself that we're avoiding. It's almost always something underneath it, a feeling we don't want to confront, a possibility we're afraid to face. Systems over goals. Why structure wins. Now let's pivot from the psychological and emotional landscape into something far more practical and actionable, because understanding why goals fail is only valuable if it leads us toward genuine solutions. And here is perhaps the single most important practical insight we'll discuss today. Goals define direction, but systems create results. Let me explain this distinction carefully, because it's subtle but profoundly important. A goal is essentially a destination. I want to lose 20 pounds. I want to become fluent in English. I want to write a novel. A system, on the other hand, is the structured process, the repeatable framework of actions that actually moves you toward that destination day after day, regardless of fluctuating motivation or mood. The goal tells you where you're going. The system is the vehicle that actually gets you there. This distinction matters enormously because so many people pour all of their energy into setting ambitious, inspiring goals, while investing almost no energy into designing the systems that would actually make achieving those goals realistic. Successful people, almost universally, understand this intuitively, even if they've never articulated it in exactly these terms. They don't simply rely on inspiration or willpower in the moment. They build systems, structured environments, routines, and processes that make the desired behavior the path of least resistance, rather than something requiring constant conscious effort. Consider the example of wanting to read more books, a goal that countless people set for themselves every single year. Simply declaring, "I want to read more," provides almost no actual mechanism for achieving that outcome. But creating a daily reading system, perhaps placing a book on your pillow every morning so you see it before bed, setting aside the first 15 minutes after waking up specifically for reading, or removing your phone from the bedroom entirely so it can't compete for your attention, transforms a vague aspiration into a concrete, repeatable structure. The goal hasn't changed, but the probability of achieving it has increased dramatically, simply because a system now exists to support it. This connects directly to the concept of environment design, which deserves particular emphasis. Our environment exerts a far more powerful influence over our behavior than most of us realize or are willing to admit. If your phone is within arm's reach while you're trying to study English, you will almost certainly check it more often than if it's in another room entirely. If junk food is visible and accessible in your kitchen, you'll eat more of it than if it's simply absent from your home altogether. Designing your environment thoughtfully, removing obstacles to good behavior, and removing temptations toward unhelpful behavior is often far more effective than relying on raw willpower in the moment of decision. There's also the concept of decision fatigue worth mentioning here, the well-documented phenomenon whereby our capacity for good decision-making deteriorates throughout the day as we make an increasing number of choices, large and small. This is precisely why structure and routine prove so valuable. By removing the need to make repeated decisions about when, where, and how to pursue a goal, we conserve mental energy for the actual execution of that goal, rather than depleting it through constant deliberation. When consistency is built into the very design of your day, rather than depending on a fresh decision each time, it becomes dramatically easier to sustain over the long term. So here's the reflection question for this section, and I genuinely want you to consider it carefully. Do you currently have goals, or do you have systems? Because there is an enormous difference between hoping you'll study English consistently and actually building a structure. A specific time, a specific place, a specific routine, perhaps even a specific podcast feed that automatically delivers Code Your English to your device every single week. That makes consistency the natural default outcome, rather than something you have to force into existence through sheer willpower alone. Resilience. Learning to fail without quitting. Let's now turn our attention toward a quality that I believe is absolutely essential, yet frequently undervalued, in any conversation about achieving meaningful goals. Resilience. And before we go any further, I want to offer a fundamental reframing of failure itself, because I believe our cultural relationship with failure is, in many ways, deeply distorted and unnecessarily harsh. Failure, properly understood, is not the opposite of success. It is, in fact, an integral and unavoidable part of the very process that leads toward success. Every single person who has ever achieved anything meaningful and lasting has experienced setbacks, mistakes, and periods of apparent failure along the way. The defining difference between those who eventually succeed and those who don't isn't the absence of failure. It's how they respond when failure inevitably occurs. Setbacks, when viewed through the right lens, function as feedback rather than as verdicts on our worth or capability. When something doesn't go as planned, that outcome contains valuable information. Information about what isn't working, what needs to be adjusted, what assumptions might have been incorrect. People who sustain long-term success have generally cultivated the ability to extract this feedback without collapsing into despair or self-condemnation. They view a failed attempt not as proof that they should quit, but simply as data that informs the next attempt. This is why resilience ultimately matters more than perfection in the pursuit of any meaningful goal. Perfectionism, ironically, often becomes one of the greatest obstacles to actual achievement, because it sets an impossibly high standard that makes any deviation feel like catastrophic failure. Resilience, by contrast, accepts that progress will inevitably include mistakes, missteps, and periods of regression, and it builds the emotional capacity to continue moving forward despite these inevitable imperfections. Progress, in other words, is rarely a straight line. It's a winding, occasionally backward-moving path that, when viewed from a sufficient distance, still trends consistently upward over time. Recovery, too, deserves specific attention here. It's not simply about avoiding failure altogether, which is, frankly, an impossible standard for any ambitious goal. It's about how quickly and gracefully we recover after failure occurs. Do we spiral into prolonged self-criticism that prevents us from taking any further action for weeks or months? Or do we acknowledge the setback, extract whatever lesson it offers, and return to action relatively quickly? This capacity for recovery is closely tied to the concept of self-compassion. the ability to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding we would naturally extend to a close friend who experienced a similar setback, rather than subjecting ourselves to harsh, unproductive self-criticism that accomplishes nothing beyond making us feel worse. Ultimately, success belongs, almost without exception, to those who simply continue. Not to those who never fail, because virtually no one fits that description, but to those who refuse to allow failure to become the final chapter of their story. So here are the reflection questions for this section. How do you typically respond when you fail at something that genuinely matters to you? And, perhaps more revealingly, do your setbacks tend to break you, leaving you discouraged and unwilling to try again? Or do they teach you something valuable that informs and improves your next attempt? From goal setting to self-transformation. As we approach the close of today's episode, I want to bring everything we've discussed together into a single unified reflection, because I believe the deepest truth about goals isn't really about the goals themselves at all. It's about what those goals reveal to us, about who we are, and who we're still becoming. Goals, when we examine them honestly, are not merely about external achievement, not simply about the number on a scale, the figure in a bank account, or the fluency level we eventually reach in a new language. They are, in a much deeper sense, mirrors. They reveal our relationship with discomfort, our tolerance for delayed gratification, our underlying beliefs about our own worth and capability, and the often invisible identity that quietly governs our daily choices. When a goal fails, it's rarely because the goal itself was unreasonable or impossible. More often, it's because something deeper within us, an unexamined belief, an unresolved fear, an identity that hadn't yet caught up with our aspiration, simply wasn't yet aligned with what we were asking of ourselves. This is why I genuinely believe that success, in any meaningful and lasting sense, begins with inner change rather than external strategy alone. Strategies, techniques, productivity systems, all of these matter, and we've discussed several of them today. But none of them will compensate indefinitely for an identity that contradicts the goal, for emotional resistance that remains unacknowledged, or for unrealistic expectations that set us up for premature disappointment. The outer work and the inner work must, ultimately, proceed together. So, as we close, I want to leave you with 3 final reflection questions, and I genuinely encourage you to sit with these. Perhaps even write your answers down somewhere, rather than simply letting them pass by as background noise. First, what goal matters most to you right now, in this current season of your life? Not what you think should matter, not what would impress other people, but what genuinely matters to you, in your own heart, today. Second, what is truly standing in your way? And I want you to push past the surface-level answer, "I don't have enough time," "I'm too busy," and dig toward the deeper truth, because as we've explored extensively today, the real obstacle is rarely external circumstance alone. And third, perhaps the most transformative question of all, what kind of person must you become in order to succeed at this goal? Not what must you do, though doing certainly matters, but who must you become? Here is the closing message I want to leave echoing in your mind long after this episode ends. Goals don't fail because dreams are impossible. They fail because genuine change asks far more from us than mere intention ever could. It asks for awareness, the willingness to honestly examine our own patterns, beliefs, and emotional responses. It asks for honesty, the courage to admit when we're avoiding something rather than simply pretending the avoidance doesn't exist. It asks for patience, the capacity to trust a slow, often invisible process rather than demanding instant, dramatic results. And ultimately, it asks for transformation, not just in our behavior, but in our very sense of who we are and what we believe ourselves to be capable of. And with that, dear listener, we've reached the end of today's episode. I sincerely hope that this conversation gave you not only a richer vocabulary around psychology, motivation, and self-improvement. Words and phrases like behavioral inertia, delayed gratification, limiting beliefs, environment design, and self-compassion, but also a genuinely useful framework for understanding your own relationship with your goals, whatever they happen to be. If today's episode resonated with you, if even one of these ideas struck a chord or gave you a new way of thinking about a goal you've struggled with, I would be so grateful if you took just a moment to subscribe to Code Your English wherever you're listening to this podcast, whether that's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other platform. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode, and if you genuinely enjoyed this conversation, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with a friend who you think might benefit from it, whether that's a friend working on their English, a friend working on their goals, or, ideally, both. Remember, here on Code Your English, our mission has never simply been to teach you vocabulary lists or grammar rules in isolation. Our mission is to help you think more deeply, express yourself more richly, and engage with the world more fully, all while building genuine, lasting fluency in English along the way. Every episode is an opportunity not just to learn new words, but to encounter new ideas, and I genuinely believe that the two go hand in hand far more than most language learning resources ever acknowledge. So, until next time, I want to leave you with one final thought to carry with you throughout your week. The goal you've been struggling with isn't a reflection of your weakness. It's an invitation toward deeper self-understanding. Take what we've discussed today: the myth of motivation, the power of identity, the quiet influence of habits, the danger of unrealistic expectations, the reality of emotional resistance, the importance of systems, and the necessity of resilience, and apply even just one of these insights this week. Choose one small, honest, intentional step forward. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. This has been Code Your English, and I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep coding your English, one thoughtful conversation at a time. Take care, and goodbye for now.